So according to Darwin, what he said, those who are fit and capable of reproducing are the ones that survive and the others will not. Most minimal requirement is one more species on which it can feed. If both the species are not benefited, one is detrimental to the other, then it is called as competition. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to another session of chapter 13 of second PUC, that is Organisms and Population. I am Dr. Divya, Biology Faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru, Temple of Excellence. So in the previous session of this chapter, we had discussed about the growth rates, that is how to measure the growth or increase in the size of a population, wherein we learnt about the exponential growth model and the logistic growth model, wherein we understood the logistic growth model is the most realistic one. In today's session, we shall discuss about the interactions between the various organisms in a population. So, in a population, if each of the organism has to survive, they have to interact with each other, because we had learned that no organism can live isolated, right? So, what are the different adaptations or methodologies they follow? We shall look into it. So, to begin with, we shall see the life history of the variation. So, in a population, the population size tends to vary, right? And there are different factors which actually makes the population to vary. So, here populations evolve to maximize their reproductive fitness. So, here in a population, the species have to vary and have to evolve if they have to be reproductively fit, so that they can move on to the next generation, right? So, it is nothing but the Darwinian's fitness theory. So, according to Darwin, what he said, those who are fit and capable of reproducing are the ones that survive and the others will not. So, these have a higher R value. That is, R value is nothing but intrinsic rate of natural increase. So, they have an intrinsic rate of natural increase because they are fit and capable of reproducing, therefore adding on to the population. So, that is why they have a higher R value in the habitat in which they live. So, under a particular set of selection pressure, organisms evolve themselves. So, every time there is a selection pressure, be it the selection pressure because of the competition between the organism, because of the environmental conditions and whatnot, right? So, here when these selection pressures exist, the organisms have to tend to evolve in order to overcome these selective pressures and reproduce efficiently. So, what are the different adaptations they follow? We shall see. So, here some organisms breed only once in their lifetime. So, not all organisms can breed throughout. Some are the ones which can breed only once in their lifetime. Say for example, if they are living for about 50 years, only once in 50 years they will reproduce. So, here one such example is a Pacific salmon fish and the bamboo. So, bamboo is said to flower once in 100 years, and once the bamboo flowers, the plant will perish. So, saying that, do we think that they are not fit for survival? They are, but that is why we are not talking about only the time duration or the number of times they reproduce. It is not the number of times that reproduce that matters here, but whether they reproduce and they add on to the population, that is what can be considered. For the best example here is Pacific salmon fish and bamboo. They reproduce but only once in a year, but in spite of that also they are adding on to the population, right? So, that is why they can be considered to be fit. And while others, they breed many times during their lifetime. That is, most of the birds and the mammals during their lifetime, they can breed many number of times, or they can reproduce many number of times. And some produce large number of small sized offspring. So, here those which produce smaller size offspring and those which produce larger size offspring, we cannot say that those producing smaller size offspring are unfit. No. Why? Because they are capable of reproduction. They are adding on to the population. Only thing is size is small here. That's it. So, here the best example is the oysters and the pelagic fishes. So, oysters as well as the pelagic fishes, they produce very small organisms. The size of the organisms that they produce is very small. But in spite of that, they are fit and they are adding on to the population, while others produce small number of large-sized offspring. So here the numbers are more, but the size is small, whereas some others, especially the birds and mammals, they produce lesser number of offsprings, but the size of the offspring is more. Therefore, here, be it the organism size or be it the number of organisms they produce or the number of times that they reproduce do not matter here. Only thing that matters here is the organism has to be fit and they need to reproduce so that they can add on to the population very well. So that is what actually matters here. Next, moving on to the population interaction. So there are a lot of different populations of species and living in a particular habitat. How do they interact with each other? How do they cope with each other for their survival? We shall understand. So for any species, the most minimal requirement is one more species on which it can feed. So here that is why no species can live isolated. They have to live in a community wherein different species are there so that one species can feed on the other. The carnivores can feed on the herbivores and the herbivores can feed on the plant material. So they have to live with an understanding with each other. Even a plant species which makes its own food. So we might think that the plants can survive on its own because they are autotrophs. They need not have to depend on another organism for their food, right? But here plants also cannot survive in an isolated condition or individually they cannot survive. They have to survive within a population. The best example we can take of is the plants, though can make their own food, they cannot survive alone because it needs the help of soil microbes to break down the organic material in the soil. So, if the organic material in the soil is broken, say for example, nitrogen itself, nitrogen cannot be absorbed. Nitrogen is available in the atmosphere, even in the soil, even lightning also it is produced every now and then. Nitrogen is made available to the plant. But the plant cannot utilize the nitrogen directly. It will take the help, right? It needs to take the help of the rhizobium bacteria or the azotobacter, etc. in order for the nitrogen to be converted into ammonia and nitrates, and then it is being utilized by the plants. So likewise, any organic material that is there in the soil, it has to be broken down by the microbes into smaller bits and then only utilized by the plants and return the inorganic nutrients for absorption. So the organic nutrients in the soil are broken down by the microbes, and these organic nutrients which are broken down as inorganic nutrients are then absorbed by the plants. So therefore, plants and microbes have a mutualistic relationship with each other. And in nature, animals, plants as well as microbes, they cannot live in isolation. But they have to interact. If they have to live well, survive properly, they have to interact in various ways to form a biological community. Even in a very small community also, many interactive linkages exist, although all may not be readily apparent or readily visible to us. But in spite of that, each and every organism on this planet, one or the other way, they depend on or they interact with another organism for their survival. And those who interact, they will survive. And those who do not will perish very, very fast. So that is about the population interactions among different species in a population. So let's talk about the population interaction in 4 different forms. So interspecific interaction, so it is between the species. Interspecific interaction arises from the interaction of population between 2 species. So if the interaction in a population is between 2 different species, we call it as interspecific interaction. So these interspecific interaction can benefit both the species, or it can be detrimental or harmful to both the species, or it can be neutral. That is, it may neither benefit one species nor it benefits the other species, but just like that the interaction will occur. So here that has been depicted in this following table, wherein for beneficial interaction they have put a plus sign. And for detrimental interaction, they have put, if it is detrimental or harmful to both the organism, they have put a minus sign here. And if it is a neutral interaction where neither of the organisms are benefited, they have put it as 0. So based on their interaction, the organisms, the interaction between the organism is classified as mutualism, competition, predation, parasitism, commensalism and emensalism. So each of these we'll study in detail one by one. So talking about to better understand, we have taken here a species A and species B. Of course, it is species A and species B because it is interaction. We're talking about the interspecific interaction, wherein the interaction is between two different species in a population. So here, plus means both the organisms are benefited. If species A and species B are benefited by the interaction, then that type of interaction is called as mutualism. Next, talking about if both the species are not benefited, one is detrimental to the other, then it is called as competition. Next, here, if one species is benefited and the other one is not benefited, then it is called as predation. Here, the predator is benefited. The one who is being predated is not benefited, right? So, it is called as predation. Next, if one species is benefited and other one is not benefited, then it is also called as parasitism. So, parasitism can be called in terms of the say for example, the tapeworm. It parasitizes inside the body of another organism. Here, the body which it makes use to parasitize, that is not benefited. But the tapeworm is benefited because it is deriving nutrition from there. So here one organism benefited and the other is not benefited. So these are not predators. So there is a difference between predator and parasitism. Predators will hunt another organism to kill it and feed on it. Whereas parasites, they will reside on another organism to feed on it. Predators will not reside on the body of the other organism. They will just hunt it, kill it and feed on it. Parasitism, parasites, they reside on the body of another organism to derive nutrition out of it. So that is the difference between the two. So best example is the lice on our head. Head lice. So head lice, they are parasites. They reside on in between a hair on a scalp, feeding on the blood, sucking on the blood, right? So that is one example for parasitism. Here, if species A is benefited and species B is neutral, that is neither it is being benefited nor it is being harmed, then it is called as commensalism. Here, one species is getting the benefits from the species B, but the species B is not taking the benefits of species A, nor it is getting harmed by the species A. It is called as commensalism. Next here, if one species is detrimental and the other species is neutral, it is called as emensalism. Here, one species is neutral. It is neither being benefited nor it is being detrimental. It is being neutral while the other is being detrimental. It is called as emensalism. So these are the 5 types the interaction in a population is classified. That is mutualism, competition, predation, parasitism, commensalism and emensalism. So all these in each of the sessions we shall study in detail. In today's session we shall discuss about predation in detail. So talking about predation. So what is predation? Here one organism is benefited whereas the other is not, right? So the first example that we can take of is the tiger and the deer. So tiger is predating over the deer. So the tiger is benefited because it will get the deer as a food, whereas the deer, it is not benefited, it is harming the deer. And one more is a sparrow eating any seed is also known as a predator. Why? The sparrow is eating the seed. It is predating on the seed. Here the seed, if the sparrow had not eaten the seed would have germinated and formed a new plant. It would have got a life, right? But here the sparrow is feeding on the seed and the seed is now perishing there. So that is why this sparrow is being benefited, but the seed is not getting any benefit. So this is one of the best example for predation here. So both, be it a tiger predating a deer as well as sparrow eating a seed, both also should be given equal importance under the predators. So next, talking about predation. So in predation, they keep prey populations under control. So prey populations under control, the best example I can take of is the deers. Imagine in a forest, the deers, the tigers were not there and no predators were there. The deer population would have increased to a greater extent. And what might happen if the deer population increases? They will start feeding on all the shrubs and eventually the shrubs would have got emptied from the forest, right? So here, what happens? They keep prey population under control. It is, in one way, it is benefited. So not all are capable of surviving. There has to be deaths in the population. You cannot have an exponential growth here, right? So that is why predator tries to maintain a logistic growth pattern here. So they keep prey populations under control, but for predators, prey species could achieve very high population densities and cause ecosystem instability. That is what I told you. The smaller fishes, they lay lakhs together of eggs. Imagine there was no fish being predated by any of the other aquatic organism. Imagine how much fish population would have filled a pond, right? It will completely imbalance the ecosystem of that particular pond. So that is why predators are very important to maintain in a population, to maintain the balance of the ecosystem. And not just that, when certain exotic species means, say for example, in India, polar bear is an exotic species to India because polar bear, you don't find them in India. So that is why it is brought from Antarctica. So polar bear is an exotic species to India. So if you bring polar bear and keep it in the zoo here, it is an exotic species. That is what is meant by exotic species. So when certain exotic species are introduced into a geographical area, they become invasive and start spreading quite fast. The best example that I can give you, very easy example to understand, is Parthenium. Parthenium did not belong to India. It was nowhere found in India, but it came from somewhere else and it predominantly occupied India. During the transport of seeds and all that agricultural seeds or agricultural products, along with that, Parthenium came into India. Nowadays, in every agricultural field, nor in the roadsides, in the forest, everywhere Parthenium grows as a weed. Now it has become, so Parthenium, it is an exotic species. It has become a weed in India. So that is how. So here, they become invasive and they start spreading fast because the invaded land does not have its natural predators. That is true because those organisms that are capable, for example, those organisms which are capable of feeding on the Parthenium do not exist. So that is why they are growing in a very invasive state. Why? Because that plant is exotic. It has come from somewhere, and in India there is no organisms which is feeding on that. So that is why. So example that we can take off is the prickly pear cactus. So the prickly pear cactus was introduced into Australia in the early 1920s, and it was introduced as an ornamental. It looked beautiful. If you see a prickly pear with the fruit and all that, it looks quite beautiful. And there are cactuses which are grown as garden plants, right? So like that it was introduced. So what happened eventually was, from the garden, these prickly pears entered into the large hectares of the forest land or the agricultural land, and they started to grow there. And finally, the invasive cactus was brought under control only after the cactus feeding predator, that is a moth, from its natural habitat was introduced into the country. So what they had to do was, from where, so cactus was an exotic species, that is prickly pear cactus. It was brought into Australia in the year 1920s. So from 1920s, the cactus started to spread so much, it started occupying the agricultural fields, various rangelands, everywhere it started to grow. Now in Australia, there is no species that is capable of feeding the cactus plant. That is why from somewhere they brought a moth which was feeding on this particular plant, and they introduced that moth in Australia, and that moth started feeding. You can see here the larvae of the moth started feeding on the prickly pear, and therefore the prickly pear population came down. That is how it is. The one more example that we can take of is in India. that is Lantana camara, the plant that is there. Nowadays in forest and all, you can find them growing abundantly, and it is a havoc to the animals because it has a lot of thorns and the animals can't pass through it. That is traveling area of the animal has completely reduced because of the that particular plant. And also not just that, that plant contains poison which is toxic to the animals, and that is why the animals even can't feed on these plants. And these plants have become so invasive that whatever tiny herbs are there, they are getting perished because of the overgrowth of the Lantana camara. So that is also one example. And still today there has not been any organism that can feed on Lantana camara. So what people do, every now and then they try to cut the plant from the forest and burn it down. But to what extent can they do that? It is not a permanent solution, right? So that is how, but they found out a permanent solution in the case of Australia's prickly pear cactus. So this is how the predation can be done. So predation here, the moth is predating on the prickly pear cactus. So next, one more example that we can take is, so these are the different examples. So predators can help keep the prey under bay. So here cheetah can keep the deers under bay, and these moths can keep the prickly pear cactus under control. So likewise, predators also help in maintaining the species diversity in a community by reducing the competition among competing prey species. Imagine there was no predators and only the prey species would have been there. What would happen? Say for example, there is a grassland. In the grassland, these deers are there. Then we have other herbivores such as the zebras are there. And we have the buffaloes, the wild buffaloes are there. Imagine if the predators were not there and the population of these three species had increased, and every of these species, every species would feed on the grass would eventually become extinct from that particular population. Then what would remain for them to feed on? And if that was the case, one by one the population would have started to perish. One by one the species would have started to perish. So that is why we have to thank the predators. The predators will prey on these herbivorous species, therefore reducing the population, therefore the available grass that can be got by the remaining population. So all the species can be maintained now. So that is how they do it. So the best example that we can take of is in the rocky intertidal communities, that is in the rocky intertidal communities of the ocean, that is American Pacific coast, the starfish, that is pisaster. So pisaster is a particular starfish that lives on the coast of American Pacific, and it is an important predator. So what scientists found out was, when the starfish was removed from its natural habitat, more than 10 species of invertebrates became extinct within a year. Why? Because of interspecific competition. So here, when the starfish was there, the other organisms was feeding on this particular starfish. Now when the starfish completely got removed from that particular American Pacific coast, then between the prey itself, between the other organisms itself, competition started, and some of the organisms, they became extinct within a year. So that is one of the best example how predators help in maintaining the species diversity. So next, talking about the harmful, what harm the predators can cause. So benefits the predator can cause is, they can maintain the balance in an ecosystem, and they can maintain the species diversity. So these two are the benefits. So predators can also cause a harm. How? We shall see. So if a predator is too efficient and if it over exploits its prey, then the prey might become extinct, and the predator might also become extinct because of lack of food. Say for example, there is a ferocious lion or a pack of lion in the forest, quite ferocious, and they keep hunting now and then, every now and then. So every now and then if they hunt more than in a short span of time, not giving the time for the deers to produce new progenies or offsprings, or not giving time for the deers to add on to the population, what might happen? Eventually these ferocious predators will completely start killing and feeding on the deers, and therefore the deer population might become extinct. So when the deer population becomes extinct and there are no other animals which the lion can feed on, then the lion's population will also become extinct eventually. So that is one of the drawback in the case of predation. And this is the reason why predators in nature are prudent. Prudent means they are very selective. Predators will not go and feed on anything or everything. So they will be choosy. So those which are fragile, those which are not capable of surviving, those which are unfit to survive, those organisms they'll go and that is, they will prey on them. So that is why they are quite prudent. And not just that, the best example is some of the plants might be poisonous. So animals, they are so prudent that they don't go and feed on that particular plant. So that is also one example for the animals being prudent. That is predators. So here predators being prudent. So here prey species, that is maybe the deer or whichever the species that are getting preyed. So preyed species have evolved various defense to lessen the impact of predation. So we shall understand this by taking some examples. So here how the prey species have adapted to prevent predation by the predators. The best example is, so here we have taken the example that is some species of insects. You can see the grasshopper, it is camouflaged with that of the leaf, and therefore it is very difficult for the birds to see these grasshoppers, and grasshoppers, they might help in pollination. So that is why it's not all the population, at least few of the population should be left in the nature, right? So that is why they have this particular mechanism of camouflaging. Likewise, here we can see the frogs. The frogs also have the mechanism of camouflaging so that the predators cannot recognize them easily and they can survive from the predators. So these are best examples. So let us take some other examples how the prey adapt themselves in order to prevent attack by the predators. So the monarch butterfly is one such example. So we have here, this is the monarch butterfly. So monarch butterfly is not eaten by the birds. Why? Because the taste of the butterfly is so awful that the birds don't feed on them. Imagine these monarch butterfly or the butterflies in general, first of all, they have a very short lifespan. And if all the birds feed on this particular butterfly, the species might become extinct, right? So that is why these butterflies, they produce a particular chemical in the body which gives that horrible taste so that the birds will not come and feed on it. So from where did that chemical come into the body of the butterfly? So butterfly, this monarch butterfly usually lays its egg on the Calotropis plant. So this is Calotropis plant. Calotropis. So this plant, all of you might have seen, it is usually seen in the gardens and all that. And so this Calotropis, it is a weed which is usually found on the roadside, fields and all that. And it is called as Ekkada Gida in Kannada. And this, it is poisonous. So these butterflies usually, they'll go and lay their eggs in this particular plant. And the larvae that comes out, they are voracious feeders. They will start eating on to the flowers and the leaves of this particular plant. And the poisonous compound that is there, or the chemical compound that is there, it will enter into the larvae of this particular butterfly. And when this larvae matures, the chemical will enter into the mature butterfly. That is how they acquire this chemical. And because of the presence of this chemical, the birds will not come and feed on it. So this is one of the very interesting adaptation that has been followed by monarch butterfly to prevent being preyed by the predator bird. So one more example is a plant. Some plants have also developed certain adaptive mechanism or defensive mechanism in order to protect itself from the herbivorous animals. So for plants, herbivores or the herbivorous animals are the predators, and nearly 25% of all insects are known to be phytopathogens. And even insects, they are phytopathogens, that is they are pathogens to the plants, feeding on the plant sap and other parts of the plant. So plants have adapted morphologically as well as chemically in order to defend the pathogens or the phytopathogens or the other herbivores that are trying to feed on it. So here we have acacia. Acacia is a plant has thorns on its stem so that the herbivorous animals will not feed on the acacia plants. Likewise, cactus also have thorns on them so that the herbivorous animals will not feed on the cactus plant. And not just that, some of the best example is Calotropis. Calotropis is also one such example where no animals will feed on Calotropis because it has poison in it. Likewise, one more example, I was talking about Calotropis. So, Calotropis plant. So, many plants produce and store chemicals that make the herbivores sick. So, that is why these herbivorous animals do not go and feed on that particular plant. So, the best example is the weed Calotropis, which usually seen growing in the roadsides, in the abundant field and all that. These contain a highly poisonous chemical compound which is called as cardiac glycosides, and because of the presence of these chemical compound, that is cardiac glycosides, which might affect the cardiac of the herbivore feeding on it, that is why the goats and the cattle, they never go and feed this particular plant. So, this is one kind of defense mechanism the Calotropis maintains. So, likewise, there are also a lot of other chemical compounds produced by different plants, that is extracted from different plants on a commercial basis, such as nicotine. So, these nicotine and all are extracted for commercial purposes, of course, but apart from that, they also render resistance to the plant against the herbivores, against the insect pests and against the plant pathogens. So, nicotine is produced by the tobacco plant, and that is why tobacco plants are not eaten by other animals. Otherwise, what would have happened in the tobacco fields? The herbivorous animals or the grazing animals would have gone and fed on them, completely incurring a loss to the farmer, right? So, here even coffee. Coffee also produces caffeine, which is a chemical compound, and that is why insects don't feed on the coffee. Next is Parthenium. Parthenium also is a weed which causes a lot of respiratory disorders. So, these Parthenium also produces quinine. So, Parthenium produces a compound, chemical compound called as quinine, and that is why the insects don't feed on them. And strychnine is also one such chemical compound which is produced by Strychnos nux vomica. This is a plant which produces strychnine, and this particular strychnine chemical compound keeps this particular plant free from the herbivores and the insects. And also opium. So, opium, that is poppy. So, this opium produces opium, which is a chemical compound. Therefore, opium is not fed by predators or by any of the insects. So, that is how different chemical compounds are also produced by the plants apart from morphological structures in order to protect themselves from the predators or from being preyed by the herbivores, the insects, the pathogens or whatever. So, this was about the session wherein we studied how in a population the interaction occurs between a population. In that we studied about predation first and how the organisms cope with each other in a population we have studied with various examples. So, in the next coming session we shall study under the population interaction. We shall study about other forms of population interaction, that is competition and parasitism. So, we shall meet again in the coming session. Thank you.